Well, good evening. This is John Bushka again. That's a picture of the cast iron building at the corner of Broadway and East 11th Street, sort of between the two villages in Manhattan. I lived there from early September of 1974 until the end of 1978. And a couple other pictures. There's the street that the Ninth Street Center was on. I think it was I think it was under that location, but in between First and Second Avenues in the East Village, and this show there's the NIH Clinical Center that's going to come into the discussion a little bit, but I just want to talk about a couple of things. Tell a little story first. Back October the 18th of 1974, I had been living in New York for about 7 weeks, and that would have been right here. See, there's Broadway, right here. It was right here. This is the cast iron building, and it was Friday night, October the 18th, and I had an appointment for an interview with a young man at the Ninth Street Center I was gonna be in a closed talk group. I'd already been screened by his partner, who was the masculine personality, this polarity theory that Paul Rosenfels had, but that he was the feminine and perhaps even more articulate, insightful person. And so I remember it was turning cold. I remember walking through here past all the way past Second Avenue and down here. The Ukrainian area, by the way, of the East Village is along Second Avenue. So I remember that. And somewhere in here, walking in the cold, and then in an apartment building very close to the center, on a walk up, I had this interview with a guy named Rick, probably in his 30s, and he grilled me like no one else ever had about my attitude about other people, about wanting to be connected as a gay man. And had recently come out finally, and I guess I was age 31 by then, having recently come out, wanting to be connected to men that were better looking and more masculine than myself, and thinking that when a man is looks not good looking, or a married man looks, gains weight, or just looks sort of uninteresting, is because of the strains of marriage, is no longer has a lot of appeal, thinking that people are morally inferior by how they look. And that was a reaction I also got when I was in NIH as a patient, back in 1962, 12 years before. That this stood out about my behavior, that I don't really talk about it openly that much. You see, um, you'll meet or encounter just hundreds of people, or thousands of people a year on the streets, everything. And, you might have a visual impression of them, but an overwhelming percentage of the people you encounter, you'll never see again, or never have any significant interaction with. So it doesn't sound like something that would matter. Yet to him, this tendency that you notice people because I would notice people the way I did, seemed really to anger other people. And that was a very strange conversation. And then I walked back to in the cold to my apartment, kind of shaking and kind of shivering in the cold, kind of shaken by the experience of the whole interview back up here. I remember walking back in the cold. It had turned dark, and it's a very and the whole thing would you could make a short film of that encounter, and brought out a very strange point about, if I as a male didn't learned to perform well enough that I felt confident in having a wife and children. And there's more to it than that. I mean, there's more to being what you're attracted to than that. But that by the time you reach your late 20s or something, that's part of whether you're going to be able to marry and live a conventional life and still pursue only people that are more desirable than you are. We used to use the word desirable in the Army barracks a lot. That's a really bad karma for you. You're really supposed to be, if you're not going to be able to have agency by having your own kids and raising your own family, you're supposed to be the person that helps take care of the people who didn't quite make it themselves, helps sort of play Amway and brings people into your life and brings more people, lifts them up out of mediocrity into meaningful life. That's the role you're supposed to play. And I wasn't playing that role. And Ricky gave me a real hard time about that. I remember not many people talk about this that way very often. But anyway, I just wanted to start with that little story. You could make a short film about that. It would maybe 20, 25 minutes. It'd be kind of bizarre if you did, but I've always thought about that. But I've said before that right now, in a sense, it's business as usual. But I'm 82 and my life is winding down. I noticed after the pandemic came to an end, I noticed didn't feel quite as strong as I had before, even though I never got very sick during the pandemic. Things were getting harder to do. The arthritis was worse and so forth. But then I gave up a lot of my online presence for reasons I've explained, concern about trademark and that kind of thing. I've talked about that before, and had a much reduced presence under my own legal name. And that was in that during that period of time, I went to some pitch fests and was able to attract some attention to the idea of a movie about do ask, do tell, about the whole parallelism between single sex intimate spaces in a dorm when I was in 1961 to the same problem in barracks in the military, which was the point of my first book in a way, one of the major points. But if you take that further, you could now, the left is saying that, wanting to replace biological sex with gender identity and making that the only marker that categorizes people, partly because a lot of people would feel like they would be treated a lot better and thought of a lot better than others if things work that way. And they say that they really are something, the other gender. And you can argue that the soul exists and maybe it's gender. You could use quantum theory maybe to argue that it's true. You could argue that maybe it is a legitimate concept. Maybe you could. Um, but that's just, I wanted this whole time to keep my own separate critical thinking voice. So I thought of people as individuals, not as members of an oppressed or oppressor group. But whether you prove yourself fit to live in the world you're born into at some level, either with the mainframe majority or perhaps as some part of some resistance, but that you have to be able to function and contribute socially within some context in the world in which you're living in. I mean, maybe you need to be a true believer and join a movement like Eric Hoffer said in 1951. Maybe you do, but that you function, you're fit to function somehow. And I always felt, particularly when the end comes, if some really catastrophic event comes, I mean, I wouldn't survive. I wouldn't be of any use if something really catastrophic happened. That would be the end. And I sort of felt when after the election, I worked the election, the 16-hour day, the day that Trump won the general election. And I had thought a few years before that I didn't think, how could I even reasonably live if he got to be president again, given what happened January 6th. But on the other hand, the left had become, in the meantime, during Biden's administration, the left had become so incredibly bellicose about gender identity and not cared if it intruded on women's rights and not cared about particularly women's spaces and so forth, and how disruptive it was trying to be. And it was also playing with, pitching to minors, changing the schools and getting minors involved, which is a real no-no for me. And I could no longer, HRC is one of my beneficiaries of the trust, but I can no longer be active supporting them. But mostly because of the position, mostly because of the trans issue with minors, which is getting more and more nuanced all the time. I just read recently that maybe some kids have mild, androgen insensitivity that isn't detected and would be a DSD, and it would be treated if it was detected. But maybe that accounts for a few of them, and maybe these laws in Tennessee and Texas would doom these kids if they were applied literally. I just read that recently, and maybe that's true. I mean, I've tried to do my own thinking as an individual and talk as an individual, which I've done ever since this started in 1997 with the publication of the first book, and I started using the internet. But after my IT career ended in the end of 2001, and I never really proved I could earn a living by myself. I started depending more on the fact that I would inherit a lot from mother. I helped take care of, but even then we hired a lot of help. And even though I was a very hard worker when I had the IT career, I was salaried. And I worked a lot of unpaid overtime and kind of paid my dues that way. Sometimes I worked a few times overtime for people that had kids and didn't get paid for it. I worked the money the time they got paid for it. Sometimes I did. And I thought I was paying my dues morally that way, but I stopped paying my dues when I was living with mother, and then she passed at the end of 2010. At the same time, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell was being lifted. That was the last thing she knew that before the last conversation I ever had with her before she went into unconsciousness was I was able to tell her that it was being repealed. And so she passed away knowing I had accomplished something that she never would have understood earlier in her life. So that means something. But there's a feeling that, I've been not really had my skin in the game in more recent years, and yet I'm a vocal speaker and interfering with the activism of others by refusing to go along with, and particularly, and I've been called scum because a transphobe and an enemy of trans people and so forth. I've been called that too. Even though I think what I'm even saying here is reasonable, you got to actually look at the medical evidence and look at what's really going on and what's really happening and what really works. And that the medical profession kind of got duped for a while by the activists, and now they're realizing a lot of what they were doing was wrong. There's some things that you can do for minors, but not the way it was going on for a few years ago, without being questioned. But yeah, there are some kids who need attention, but it's a very small number. Not enough to build an activist movement. So they needed to recruit a lot more people to support them. So they needed to have the backing of other people that they could almost compel the left to be involved in supporting them. And it's not only the left might try to silence my own speech. It's might that they would try to compel me to join them and support something I don't believe, for the common good of our side. I realize that gay men are not beyond risk with, they need to be able to get PrEP at reasonable prices, and there are other risks, the monkeypox last year. There's a lot going on there. I think this book by Roman McCrae, The End of the Gay Rights Revolution. I'm going to review that pretty soon on my blog. Um, the whole debate on age verification and the fact that all of us, even those who didn't have our own children, have a responsibility to accept some inconvenience to protect the ability of children to grow up without hearing from us until they're old enough to understand what we're doing. And this may get way beyond just pornography now. Most of the state laws still or actually define it in terms pretty explicitly, mostly in terms of what you would say is porn, but it may get to just adult subject matter like it is in Russia or was in Hungary, or maybe still is. It may restrict our ability to speak a lot more. And then, of course, the age. I think, I think you can do age verification safely if the operating systems do it, and if it's put into the device, and when you become a user of a device, you set up your age and have an API that can communicate with apps and websites easily, so that you can more easily filter out. Even a simple site like mine could very easily filter out if people are just too young to expose to the content. You could make that easy. It's not there yet, but there's a law in California that wants it to be. I think one or two other states now that wants it to be in the operating system itself. And I think that's also being pushed in Europe now. So that's probably what's going to happen. But we got to be sure that it doesn't. We don't wind up with a surveillance state, that it doesn't ruin the experience of the internet for all of us. It may get a lot less free, and I may not have the freedom that I used to have to speak as an individual. The worst thing of all would be to wind up in my life no more than just simply a member, a player on somebody, having picked somebody's team and loyal to that team and nothing more. Um, that sounds egotistical to say that, but that's how I feel about it, to be just one of the crowd on one side or the other and not be allowed to do anything else. That would be the worst thing of all. I will be looking soon, maybe the possibility of further downsizing of my life. There's the possibility of moving into a different kind of facility, and it would probably take 2 or 3 years to happen. It won't happen right away, but I may need to do that. I'm noticing changes in how I feel and everything. And yeah, if something really catastrophic happens, I don't see how it would make sense for me to be around if something. You start with nuclear war or something, but if something really catastrophic happens, I don't believe that AI is going to get out of control all of a sudden. I don't think that's it. So I'm not too worried about AI itself causing a catastrophe. I'm more worried about internationally about Russia, particularly Russia, um, than anything else. So that's kind of what I have tonight. Um, the it's still business as usual, but I'm kind of slowing down. I want to get, even if I have to reduce my activity further, I want to get a novel done, a science fiction novel that sorts explains how you might be able to travel through other worlds through ascension, becoming a certain kind of being, and then move to how angels, some people who live among us might be angels, and how there might be intermediate worlds between planets that have life, and then astral domains where you go after death. I think the what happens after death, I think there is something to it, and I think there is something to Gnosticism, that there might be more than one kind of God. That sounds like heresy, but because mathematics doesn't seem to be complete, Gödel's hypothesis and the fact you need to have an axiom of choice and all of those kinds of things you learn in graduate school. It might be that means that there is more than one hierarchy of angels in heaven or something, because math isn't always complete. Maybe that's what's going on. But those are the kind of thoughts that, that I wanted to leave you with. It's uncertain, but right now, um, in my way of thinking, Trump, most of what he's done, as erratic as he is, and he just hasn't thought carefully through some of the things he did, but most of the stuff he's been doing, they've been actually been trying to follow immigration law. I think most of what they've done is actually legal. It's distasteful as it is to us. So not as I'm actually not as shocked as I thought I would be by how the administration is going. But that's what I wanted to talk. Things. My 2 days on this in this world might be drawing to a close. And my level of activity. Want to finish a novel. Want to finish that piano sonata that's sitting. You can see it sitting on my piano there. Um, there's one other little cantata idea I had, but I want to finish a few things that might not require me being online as much. But I just wanted to bring everybody up to date and give you a sobering talk about what's going on. And I do thank you for listening.